Hi, everybody. Life in the time of COVID here, doing this from remote. My heart rate is up, so I feel like I'll bring a lot more energy to this panel now. So let's get going. Sorry about that technical difficulty. So I'll start over. Hi, everybody. I'm Danny Johnson. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications here at the Nature Conservancy. I am super excited about our next discussion, which will continue our exploration of the determining decade. This short, critical window of time we have left to decide what we want our future to be and how we can meet this moment, one where both nature and humans thrive. Our panel is called Still An Inconvenient Truth, Communicating Climate Urgency. We thought that title was apropos because it is inconvenient, acknowledging that to secure our future, we need to be honest about the state of nature on our planet. The idea that business as usual won't work, which means we have to change. Change is hard and it's inconvenient, and we're here to talk about some of that today. We've been hearing about climate change and dangerous decline of nature on our planet for decades. Yet something in that message has not translated to an immediate, massive, concerted response to the global emergency that we find ourselves living in. This panel has a unique perspective on this discussion, as all of these panelists have made it their business to dive deep into every aspect of conservation and bring those stories to the world. So I wanted to welcome our four distinguished panelists. First is Juan Gonzalez, legendary journalist, professor of journalism at Rutgers, and co-host of Democracy Now! Hello, Juan.
Hi, everyone.
Amy Martin, the founder and executive producer of Threshold, a Peabody Award-winning podcast that takes deep dives into complicated environmental issues. She is currently working on her fourth season of the show. Hi, Amy. Michelle Nijhuis is an environmental and science journalist and the author of a new book about the history of conservation called Beloved Beasts, Fighting for Life in an Age of Extinction. Thanks for joining us, Michelle. And then last but not least, Matt Simon, staff science writer at Wired, and is currently working on a book on microplastics. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. So I've got a number of questions for you all. And because this is a virtual environment, I think what we'll do is I'll state the questions. I'll throw to one of you to start the discussion. And then I'll do my best to sort of open up each question so that you can all add your thoughts and we'll make a conversation out of it. So without further ado, Amy, let's start off with you. There's so much to take in about everything we need to do to take action in the next few years to really make an impact across the board during this short window of time we call the determining decade.
I lost the question. I don't know if other people can hear that.
You froze again.
Okay. Well, how about we just try to keep talking? I'm not totally sure where that question was headed, but Juan, where do you think it was headed? And do you want to answer it?
You want me to start? Well, I mean, my view is, the average American, they turn on TV these days. Those who still watch TV, it must seem like Chevron and Exxon Mobil and all their young hip engineers that they feature in their commercials are already leading the way toward a clean energy future. So I think the problem that we have is that these ads and the media initiative of the fossil fuel industry is drowning out all the good reporting that is occurring. There's plenty of good reporting occurring. It's just not getting the resonance and the benefiting from the echo chamber that would result from more media companies following up these stories. So I think that's a big problem. The other is that unfortunately most of the commercial media is still so fixated with personal and individual violence, and not with the structural violence, the structural raping and pillaging that is occurring of the planet. And they prefer to focus on the individual incidents of murder and rape. And so we have a problem with the mindset of the media, and we have a problem with the continuing onslaught of the fossil fuel industry, which claims to be enlightened these days, but is continuing to do everything that they can to prevent systemic change in addressing the climate emergency that we face.
Yeah, I think you touched on some important topics there. And I guess one thing I would add is, the whole climate conversation began in this very wonky way that was pretty much the domain of privileged white men in the sciences and in government. And I feel like that very insular conversation that involved a lot of graphs and charts and numbers and sort of political wrangling that the average person was not privy to and didn't understand, has affected the way the message has gotten out. And then I feel like that's changing now, as people are more and more able to make connections between climate issues and personal stories and stories of communities that are disadvantaged in myriad ways, and the ways that climate intersects with all kinds of power dynamics and all kinds of other social justice issues. I think that we're slowly starting to understand how to tell this story in a way that is not only by and for certain people, but I think that kind of original spin of how the issue came into consciousness really affected the way that it got communicated and therefore the way that it got received for the first couple of decades that we were talking about. So, Michelle, I'm curious about your perspective. If you're unmuted now, hopefully. I hear you.
Am I live? Are we live?
You hear me?
Yes, Dan, we're live. We started the conversation already. So.
Okay.
Oh, thank goodness. It's lovely to be here.
Okay. So
I will take a pass on that last question because I was struggling with my mic settings. So please move on.
Okay. So the question was, how do you think about telling stories that create urgency and action in the current media environment? And what is the role of journalism in galvanizing that action?
Okay, I can jump in here to build off what Juan was saying. There's this narrative of personal responsibility that's coming to the fore here in climate change. Like we should be flying less, we should be doing everything in our power to emissions, which should absolutely happen. We should do that as a person. But I fear that kind of steers the blame for climate change away from the companies that are responsible for this, the fossil fuel companies in particular. So as Juan was saying, there's this need for structural change that we need to push toward, keeping in mind all the stuff that we can do as individuals, which are very important. But we can't lose sight of the fact that this is a massive structural worldwide problem, economic problem that we need to certainly shake up in the years and decades ahead.
Juan, did you want to?
Yeah, I would agree with that heartily, and also add that I think speaking very generally, I think the media has spent a lot of time explaining the complexity of the problem and less time explaining the complexity of the solutions. And so we tend to default into solutions that have a lot to do with personal responsibility because individual action is the easiest to understand. There's so much reporting that I think remains to be done about systemic change and how that gets accomplished, how it can be accomplished, what our options are. And because I think understandably, we have spent so much time wrestling with denialism, trying to explain that the problem exists at all. We're late in getting to that, but it's so necessary.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the ways to answer the question, Danny, to think about stories that environmental stories in general that we're trying to be a threshold is that we're really trying to now breathe more oxygen into narratives that are just old and tired and not true. So although we acknowledge that there are people who think climate change is real and actually progress, it's crucial to ensure that we're trying to tell and not use this crucial to getting their perspective out. Of course, we'll figure it out, but we're not. We've had many times people go, "Oh, we can do an episode or part of an episode trying to clarify that climate change is actually real and there's lots of it." And we're like, "What? No, we so clearly need to move beyond that." So far back in our future, but I think what we can do from the second level is pick what we're planning to write on. Like you said, trying to figure out ways to center solutions, try to center people who aren't necessarily always included in the conversation. Otherwise, their perspectives in there.
Got it. Amy, you're a little hard to hear. We're going to do a mic check on you. Juan, what are your thoughts on that? What is journalism's role in galvanizing action around climate change?
Well, I think that there's several ways you can look at it. One is the issue, for instance, we in Democracy Now! Have been doing this for decades. I mean, we spent back in 1999 at the World Trade Organization protests, we devoted 2 hours every day to covering all the grassroots movements that were dealing with the impositions that were being attempted on the nations of the world by the WTO. We've covered virtually every climate summit that has occurred over the last 20 years, and we've tried to bring as much of that as possible to the public. But I think this issue of being able to harness new technologies to new media technologies. For instance, one of the things I did recently with my students at Rutgers, an investigative reporting class, is that Rutgers has been very in the forefront of doing climate research, but no one ever held Rutgers directly responsible for its own carbon footprint. So I had my students study what were the actual emissions and the carbon footprint of Rutgers itself. We found that it's doing all this great research, but its own practice is terrible, even compared to other Big Ten schools. Yet you take a university like Arizona State University, which is really in the forefront. They do real-time monitoring of the energy usage of every single building at Arizona State University. You can go online and find out what every building is doing in terms of emissions. And therefore, you're holding not only the university in general accountable, you're holding every department and every part of the university accountable. That kind of accountability, I think, needs to be brought. We need to use live streaming in real-time tracking of who is responsible for the increases, continuing increases in the use of fossil fuels. Why aren't foundations funding young people to go live streaming all around the world and let people see what is being done to the planet on a daily, hourly, minute-by-minute basis by the emissions that are created, so that you start building followings online of people who find this fascinating and then are maybe spurred to action. We got to think of, just as live streaming was used in the Black Lives Matter protests, in the Occupy Wall Street, it could be used now.
So Juan brings up an issue about technology and real-time data.
Juan, as well as being an effective use of technology, that also strikes me as the right scale for the audience you're addressing. I mean, it's a kind of, you're talking about systemic change, but you're not talking about it on an overwhelmingly, or you're taking out a piece of it. You're not talking about, well, we need systemic change on a global scale. Readers and consumers of media can't do much with that. But a student audience can think on the scale of their university, on their campus. It gets them out of that individual action mindset and into something that is on a more cooperative level, which is, of course, where we need to be going.
Yeah, I think part of the challenge of these stories you're telling is the actual scale, and it's so hard to digest at that scale. I
still can't hear Danny. Can any of you?
I can. Yeah. So let me throw this over to Matt. So the role of technology, obviously, that's a huge piece of what you cover at Wired. What is the biggest multiple stories or that you've had your eye on that just, in your opinion, hasn't been told effectively, that isn't getting enough attention, that you feel could really help move the needle on climate change? What should we know that we don't hear enough about?
I think the way that I ever approach this tech reporting when it comes to climate change solutions is first and foremost saying that technology alone is not our savior here. It is going to get us out of this mess for sure. Things like solar power and carbon capture, perhaps, but those in and of themselves are not our end-all be-all solutions. So that's first and foremost how I approach those things. But when it comes to galvanizing interest around solutions, I wrote a story like a month ago about a super simple concept about covering all the canals in California with solar panels, which to me seemed like, okay, it's an interesting story enough as it is, but the story did like crazy traffic, and I was just not expecting that, because I think it was this, oh, duh kind of moment for a lot of readers. Why don't we just slap a bunch of solar panels on canals and do it that way? So, I mean, there are these technological solutions, but we then come up against this moral hazard, right? Like falling back on something like carbon capture, sucking carbon literally out of the atmosphere, sequestering it underground. But that is far from a wide-scale proven technology. So first and foremost, technology is great. I think at Wired we have a mandate to cover that sort of thing. But first and foremost, we need to bring down emissions using some of those technologies, to be sure, but not losing track of that goal, which is to crash emissions as quickly as possible.
Right. Okay, so following on the story of what are we not hearing enough about, I throw it to Juan and to Amy. What do you guys think? What do we need to know more about?
Well, one of the stories that I think is really not understood and could help most Americans really begin to understand the impact of climate change on their lives is the migration crisis. You know, over the last 20 years, the migration crisis at the southern border has switched from a largely Mexican migration to largely Central American migration. There are many more people coming over the Mexican border from Central America than from Mexico itself. Why is that? And I would say that it's not simply violence and corruption in their local government. It's climate change. Beginning with Hurricane Mitch in '98, a Category 5 storm that killed 10,000 people and dislocated 1.5 million. There have been a series of tropical storms, including 2 last summer, that are continuously causing havoc in Central America. And in addition to, there is a developing and growing drought in the dry corridor of Central America through Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And the Central Americans, along with the Puerto Ricans who were forced to leave the island after Hurricane Maria, I would submit to you, are the first climate refugees that have hit the United States shores. And this is going to be a developing crisis. And we have to get to the American people that migration in this country, as well as in other parts of the world, is increasingly a result of our failure to address the climate emergency that the planet faces.
Amy?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Some of the reporting that we've done in coastal Alaska, talking about the abandonment of those people and the migration that they are being forced to do or consider, it kind of is right in line with that. We're certainly not the only ones who've reported on that, and yet reported as many people as report on it. It seems like nothing is changing for them. So I want to lift that up. I guess I also think from another perspective that something that is not being covered enough is the many, many scientists who are working incredibly hard to figure out ways out of this. And not only scientists, but I think scientists in particular don't do a great job. They're not PR people, for a reason, and that's a good thing. But there are people that are they've spent decades mapping out models for what steps we need to take and how we need to take them. And I think that we need, as journalists, to be willing to engage with some of that complicated data and try to break it down, try to be the translators from the lab out into the world so that their work can get
more visibility, and so that people can start to understand not only the problems, but the pathways forward.
Michelle, can you hear us okay?
I can. Now I can hear everyone. Thank you for your patience.
We've leveled out. Go ahead. Over to you.
Well, I mean, one thing I would add to what Amy just said is from researching the history of conservation for the past couple of years, one thing that I think is missing in both in the conservation movement and then in journalists who cover it is social science, which of course is where we are finding our solutions, because both the climate problem and the conservation problem are the solutions are going to come from human behavior. And I think many activists and perhaps many journalists who cover these issues come from at least an interest in science or some science background. So we default to the life sciences and trying to explain the complexity of the life sciences, but we really need to spend more time with the social sciences and the humanities and trying to show where that kind of research is leading us, because that's the research that's leading us toward the solutions, I think.
Thank you for that. Let's move on to another question. So certainly we came here to discuss the role of journalism and the responsibility you all might feel to drive understanding and action around critical environmental issues. But what about consumers? You all have armies of readers and subscribers. What can they do to contribute by supporting voices that speak truth in climate and the environment? And the question is, who out there is doing a great job, besides present company, obviously, of communicating these issues? Is there an outlet, a journalist, a certain type of storytelling that's really breaking through, that you never miss reading, that you think other people should tune into? What's going on out in your world that's working from a journalistic perspective around climate and the environment? I'll throw that, Matt, why don't you jump in?
Sure. I think increasingly what we've been seeing in the coverage is more personal stories. And what actually struck me from one of the Democratic debates for the last presidential election, all the Democratic nominees delve into these personal stories about folks that they had talked to that have been affected by climate change. I think in particular in recent years, we have been seeing much more of that. And that, I think, kind of brings the problem of climate change home, in that I think a lot of Americans have up until this point think that climate change wasn't going to affect them. And it certainly is now affecting everybody. The underprivileged much worse, as per usual with our systemic problems in the United States. They're being affected the worst. And I will just add that this is not an ideal time to see the collapse of local news. It's terribly timed. We could be using very much more investment there to bolster that coverage on the local level.
Amy, over to you. What do you think?
I feel like the Washington Post has an amazing team of people doing environment reporting. I mean, I read everything that Juliet Elperin writes and Chris Mooney, and I think that there are people that are kind of on the front lines there in the daily grind, like paying attention to what's happening and just generating story after story after story that's trustworthy and tries to quickly get to deeper levels that I really respect and am grateful for. Since I'm in the podcasting and radio world, I'm very attuned to what's happening on NPR. I think they have some fantastic reporting, and I guess kind of echoing what Matt said, I think some of the great reporting on public radio comes from the member stations. I mean, in addition to the mothership in DC, but some of the member stations, I'm thinking of Tegan Hanlon at Alaska Public Media, many more who are maybe not household names across the country, but are providing crucial, on the ground reporting from local communities about how different environmental issues are affecting people. So those are, and then there's also, like the giants. Elizabeth Colbert is fantastic, and I just read her latest book, and it's great. And those are a few on my hit list.
Juan, what do you think? Michelle, you're about to speak up. Go ahead, and then we'll go to Juan.
I would just like to, not so much as a news source, but as a promising development, I would love to call out Report for America, which is seeding young reporters in local news outlets all over the country. We need more initiatives like that. The Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting is funding great stories about climate change all over the world, and funding many different kinds of media. I think it's allowing reporters, because it gives reporters, many of them freelance, the funding and the backup they need to experiment with new story forms and new approaches. I think their model is a really important one. And Manga Bay has been around for a long time, and they do a great job, I think, of covering biodiversity and climate issues in a much deeper and more internationally focused way than most media outlets. And I mean, they're one of the only places I know of that's covering indigenous land rights as part of the conservation conversation. And I think that is one of the most undercovered stories out there, because indigenous and rural community land rights are such a huge part of how we can ethically and effectively get to conserving 30% of our lands and waters by 2030, if that is in fact our global goal for conservation and climate change. So yeah, Manga Bay, Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting, and then Report for America as a way of bulking up our local news, which I heartily agree we are in dire and increasing need of. Because I would just add that I think that personal stories are such an effective way to be talking about climate change, because it is this abstract problem that is difficult, I think, for our little brains to relate to. But I would also just say that it's tragic to me. It's a sign of our failure. I mean, when I started covering climate change in the early 2000s, it was a struggle to find visible examples of climate change. And it was a struggle to get scientists to acknowledge or to take the step of connecting what they were seeing on the ground with climate change, because they're trained to be cautious, and that's understandable, but they were just beginning to be willing to make that connection. Now that's not a problem anymore, but it's a way to tell more powerful stories, but it's also just a tragic sign of how late we are to the game.
Yeah. Thank you, Michelle. Juan, over to you. What's working? Who's doing it right? And what's breaking through? What do you think?
Well, I think, my view is that there's always been very good reporting in a lot of different publications and news outlets over the years. I mean, I think just recently, Newsday had this phenomenal story about how Grumman aircraft for 40 years had been polluting the groundwater on Long Island, and it was kept hidden. Now, it's great that Newsday did. Now, I wish they had done it 20 years ago when Grumman was still a big operation on Long Island. But at least they did it now. And then ProPublica, partnered with the Times Picayune and with the Black-owned newspaper in Jackson Advocate, to expose the continuing polluters' paradise of Cancer Alley in Louisiana, especially its effect on the African American community. So there are always these great stories. My problem is that they come and go, and also there's no megaphone, there's no echo chamber where the other media companies pick it up and keep repeating it until it actually reaches a critical mass of the American people. So many of these stories have small followings because the rest of the media don't amplify them. And I think that's the problem, that how do you amplify these great stories and then draw lessons from larger groups of people? As a young reporter at the Philadelphia Daily News in 1980, I wrote a series of articles about cancer in Philadelphia, how it happened to be in all of the areas, because Philadelphia had the 8th highest cancer rate of any county in the United States back in the 1980s. And it was a direct result of pollution from 2 oil refineries that existed back then in South Philadelphia, the Arco refinery and the Sun Oil refinery, and of a raft of chemical plants in the Bridesburg section of Philadelphia that were run by Roman, Haas, and Allied Chemical. And people around them were all dying of cancer. They had been doing it for years. So, you can have these stories and they come and go, but unless you amplify them and mobilize masses of people to do something about them, they go by the wayside.
Thank you, Juan. I want to pick up something that Michelle mentioned, which is this disconnect between sort of conserving nature and our lives, right? We think about that a lot, especially in the marketing group here. at the Nature Conservancy, there seems to be this divide that's developed where what's happening in our natural world is somehow seen as out there and less connected to our actual lives, as opposed to meaning nature is the air we breathe, the water we drink. Every day of our lives is made possible because nature, right? Because we have nature around us and we need nature everywhere. From a messaging perspective, we battle that a lot. Like, how do we actually bring nature into the real life position of being part of people's lives? Can you talk a little bit about your perspective on this and how we can cure that? What I think is a dangerous perception that nature and the state of nature is something out there, because I feel like our audience is sort of just starting to turn a corner where they've looked out their window and seen mega fires, right? They've looked out their front door and seen the ocean higher than last year. I think I'll throw this. Amy, can you start us off on this one? How do we close?
Sure. Sure. I mean, I guess I think that the problem, if we think about this a fair amount at Threshold, and I think that the problem, if we really want to go back to it, is like baked into the English language. It's baked into the Judeo-Christian, cultural imprint of our whole society. So I definitely don't think it's like a new problem, and I don't think it has an easy, fix. Because I mean, ever since we invented the story, or in my view, invented the story of the Garden of Eden is here and people are out there, we've created this nature versus man and woman paradigm that we're still stuck in. I think that, it's important to remember that not all cultures and not all religions and not all languages have that imprinted so deeply. And so I think one of the things that we can do is try to pay attention to the many, many cultures, most of them indigenous, that don't have those divides that are affecting, before we even say the word. In order for us to talk about this, we have to talk about this thing called nature that's separate from us. And it's BS. We are nature. It's not just the fires in the ocean. It's our skin and bones and our cells. It's everything. It's the food we eat. And so, I mean, one of the ways that we try to handle it on our show is that when we talk about, we have to use the language that we have. We are in the culture that we're in. So we try to sort of like give a little aside to the audience. Like, I'll often say something like, yeah, well, we're trying to make sense of this thing that we call nature, just to sort of flag, like, what is that even? Why are we saying that? But I think that realistically, I mean, this is a massive culturally embedded issue that, it's going to take generations for that to shift. And all we can do is just pick a little bit at it here and there and just try to raise a flag that, like, this paradigm has some issues. And in fact, it might be the issue. So.
Right. Yeah, it's huge. I want to give everybody else some time as well. Thank you, Amy. That was brilliant. Keeping an eye on time, we've got about 10 minutes left, so I want to make sure I've got like 27 questions. Obviously, I won't get to all of those. Mm-hmm. Maybe, Matt, over to you. What are your thoughts? Closing the divide between the idea of nature and us.
I think in a weird way, climate change actually gives us as science communicators an opportunity to talk about how interconnected these Earth systems really are. So, like taking the Arctic as an example, why is it warming at least twice as fast, if not more, than the rest of the planet? Well, it has something to do with the currents coming in from far away, but there's also these albedo changes. As ice retreats, it exposes more dark land that absorbs more of the sun's energy. And it's weird that actually, as that's happening, science is learning more about how interconnected these systems are. So what happens to the ecosystems as the Arctic is changing? How do wildfires become more prevalent up there? And how is that actually connected to the same reasons why we're getting worse wildfires in California, in Australia? So I think in the same time as scientists are learning more and more about how climate change is impacting these interconnected, extremely complex systems, be they ecosystems or Earth systems more generally, we can also talk about how we as humans fit into that, how that is affecting everybody on this planet is now affected by climate change without exception. We're all connected into these extremely complex systems, which is a really interesting opportunity for science to learn more about this and for us to communicate that to the public.
Over to you. I'll go Michelle and Juan. Let's hear.
Yeah. Well, when I was working on my book, about conservation history, I set myself the challenge of not using the term nature and not using the term wild or wilderness. Now, that's not something I would recommend to the Nature Conservancy, but but it's easier than you might think. And I found it to be a very good, I found it changed my habits of thinking just a little bit, because you can often, so when you talk about nature, what are we really talking about? Are we talking about other species? Are we talking about habitats? You can almost always find another word inside the bucket we call nature to define what you're really talking about. And especially with wild and wilderness, which has come to mean so many things to so many different people. It's a legal definition as well as a emotional state of mind. And so I think we as journalists can look more closely at the language that we use and perhaps make more changes than we think are possible. I also think that we can, and this applies especially to photo editors, but to writers as well, we can look beyond iconic species and iconic stories. I think we have an understandable urge to default to those because we think that that's how people are going to connect most closely to these issues, or most quickly to these issues. But I think I like to think that audiences are ready for a more complex look at these stories, and by defaulting to these iconic stories and iconic species, we reinforce this idea that these are very simplistic problems with perhaps simplistic solutions. And one more thing I would just quickly add, which connects back a little bit to the previous question, is that I do think, I agree with what Juan was saying about amplifying our stories, but I think it's also important to think about, well, who is the best audience for our particular stories? We don't need every story to start a mass movement. We need every story to reach the person has the influence needed to make a change. And so sometimes small outlets that are directed to the right audience can be extremely powerful in affecting real change.
Thank you, Michelle. Juan?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how to answer that question, except to say that we live in a world where data analytics is like the thing. Everyone's into data analytics. And I always love it when you hear some natural disaster and they say it was a once in 100-year storm or once in 100-year flood. Well, nature doesn't care about your data analytics anymore. And I think that people have to get acquire more humility when dealing with nature. And I know that everybody wants to have a house by the sea with unfettered views, but you can't. You shouldn't necessarily have one. The Maldives is going underwater, and you should be thinking about that. The Caribbean is going underwater. You should be thinking about that and stop worrying about your house by the seashore, which I think is a fetish of the United States that we need to get rid of.
Fair enough. Okay, so I'm going to stick with Juan. We've got 5 minutes left. So let's keep just a short answer, your thoughts on, all of you have such a wide view of things. You go out, you talk to organizations, you investigate the science, the technology. I would ask you, what keeps you optimistic? Like, what are you seeing in the conservation movement, in the environmental movement? What makes you optimistic and keeps you up? Let's start with
the young people. The young people have a whole different mindset these days. Best exemplified by Greta Thunberg, who we've had on Democracy Now! Numerous times. And I think that the young people are approaching the future of the planet in a much different way than those of us who are of a certain age.
Amy?
I'm inspired by people who are willing to focus strongly on what they are saying yes to. Whatever realm they're coming from. I'm less inspired at this point in my life or in my reporting, I guess, by what people are saying no to. I think we've had lots and lots of no, and we need to have more no, but it just feels tired on my ear at this point. And I find energy from people who are able to say, yeah, I might not want all of these things, but here's my North Star. Here's what I'm heading toward. That often just leaves me feeling energized.
Michelle?
Well, I think hope and optimism are somewhat overrated. I like to think that what we need most is a sense of possibility and a sense of resolve. And what gives me both of those things, actually, somewhat surprisingly to myself, is the lens of history, looking back on what conservationists and activists have accomplished over the last 150 years. It's not enough. It's messy. It's full of failure, but there has been an arc of progress, and there have been a lot of successes that we often take for granted because we're used to having these species around. We're used to having national parks. We're used to having certain habitats protected. All of those things were done by individual people who might not have been that hopeful or optimistic. They were just doing what they thought was right without any guarantee it was going to work out.
Thanks, Michelle. Matt, what do you think?
I guess I'll put on my hat as a reporter at a technology magazine and say that I'm very optimistic about the way that the technology is coming along, with the usual caveat, of course, that it's not our only exit, the only ingredient out of this. But in particular, the plummeting cost of solar and wind it's huge. We're so well on our way. We just need to accelerate that movement as much as possible. But again, not going to get us out of this entirely. We need a fundamental behavioral change and systemic change all across the world, behaviorally and economically.
Great. Thank you, Matt. And speaking of technology, I'd like to apologize for our small technical gap at the beginning of this and for your patience. I can't thank you all enough for what you're doing out there in the world as conservation communicators. And I also can't thank you enough for joining us today. Really appreciate the time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
I don't really want to paint a picture of just doom and gloom. I mean, I do think that we do have quite a bit of work to do to get back on the right track, but I also see hope. This is the determining decade, and what makes me optimistic is that there is more awareness than ever, more action than ever, and there are more people working to correct the world's environmental problems than ever. And the next generation seems to me to be well positioned to turn this canoe around and steer us to a more sustainable future.
When I think of Earth Day 2021, it occurs to me that the COVID-19 pandemic, the catastrophic wildfires in California, not to mention the series of extreme weather events of the past few years, which have only grown in frequency and intensity, they've all reminded us that the worst can happen, and that these events are really just a dress rehearsal for what awaits us if we do not take meaningful, comprehensive, decisive action now to protect this planet. And that's why I urge you to join me in supporting the extraordinary work of the Nature Conservancy, which is as well positioned as any organization on Earth to really turn the tide on climate change and continue the work they've been doing for decades to conserve, preserve, and protect this planet we call home.